How do you think the temperatures have changed? Have you? I mean, Greenland is somewhere where you've been back a few times, isn't it? If I'm correct.
Yeah, I've been to Greenland over a dozen times, and the thing about expeditions in my sort of let's say I'm going to be traveling on the ice for a few decades. The difference that I'm going to see on expeditions from what might be a cumulative 2, 3, 4 degree overall change in air temperature, I'm probably not going to notice. What I notice most as a traveler is in fact the different weather conditions, that the wider global impacts of what's happening and the change that's happening, what those impacts lead to. And that can mean storms, it can mean more storms earlier in the season. It can also mean that the sea ice behaves very differently. So although I'm not going to be noticing a degree or two, what I do notice is the unpredictability. Now, the Arctic has always been an unpredictable place to travel. You know that a storm can appear in a split second, but it's the ferocity and it's the unusual times of year that these now seem to be rolling through that can take you unawares and you need to be aware of. I think that the changes in Greenland are going to be more noticeable for the people who live there year round, because of course I can pick my times to travel. And in fact, even if I was to say, right, the late spring, for instance, is now no longer good for travel because the thaw comes a little bit earlier than it did 10 years ago, I'm just going to shift everything forward a bit. So I will simply set off 2 weeks earlier or 3 weeks earlier. So I can actually adjust for that. The problem comes for those who live there permanently and they can't be as picky as I can about travel times.
So what's that going to be like you just said that change over the last 10 years. What's that going to be like over the next 50 years?
Well, I don't think anyone really knows. I mean, you can look at the trends, you can look at the graphs, and we can, of course, extrapolate where that's going to go next. Now, of course, things can slow, things can accelerate. Most people, I suppose, will assume that if this graph is going off in a certain trajectory, that's likely to continue unless something dramatic changes in the planet's behavior and in our behavior, I suppose, as well.
Our behavior, yeah.
In 50 years' time, I suspect in 50 years' time, it might be towards the end of my career. And I expect that the possibilities for expeditions will be completely and utterly unrecognizable compared to what we can manage now. And even in the last 10 years, I've only been going just over a decade. What I have noticed is that certain logistical options, so places where we used to be able to be dropped off for expeditions 10 years ago, and even just sort of when I was looking at getting into expeditions and was still seeing it as more of a theory in my future, and I was looking at other people's expeditions, I was looking at possibilities for being dropped off, for instance, off the Russian coast for North Pole expeditions. Now, that has been completely impossible for years now, and even in the final days, in the final few years when the Russians were offering logistics. This is a private Russian company that used to offer helicopter drop-offs for North Pole expedition teams. The last communication I had off the boss was there is enough ice off the Cape, off the bit of land where we would set off from, maybe for a cocktail. There is not enough ice for you to ski on. Whereas just a few years later, they were setting off 2 or 3 teams a year onto good quality sea ice, and they were able to travel north from there. So yes, the change is substantial even within the period of time that I've been working. And in Greenland, I tend to come back to Greenland a lot because it's where I've traveled most, even though I don't want to be typecast as just a Greenland guy.
Yeah.
But the routes that I was doing in 2007, 2008, which isn't that long ago, that was right back in my early 20s when I was getting started, those routes are now impossible. Because, first of all, the government now won't give you a permit to travel early because they got worried about people basically getting too cold, which I didn't really fully understand. I believe that you should travel in the colder part of the season because then the snow and the ice tend to be in better condition. And frankly, you should be able to deal with cold temperatures if you're there. And that pushed people later into the season. And then the melt is sort of coming at you from the other end, at the other end of the season. And now the melt season is now constraining traveling so much that you simply couldn't do the routes that I was managing back then, including a nearly 4-month expedition, which obviously needs to have a very, very long window of travel time in order to fit that in. That was a 113-day expedition.